Lying on the edge of town, we rarely heard footsteps at night or carriage wheels, but the darkness in every season was deepened by the lonely sound of locomotive whistles. I no longer wonder, as I did when I was 6, that Aunt Mary Van York, arriving at dusk for her first visit to us, looked about her disconsolately and said to my mother, "Why in the world do you want to live in this God-forsaken place, Mary?" Almost all my memories of the Champion Avenue house have as their focal point the lively figure of my mother. I remember her tugging and hauling at a burning mattress and finally managing to shove it out a bedroom window onto the roof of the front porch, where it smoldered until my father came home from work and doused it with water. When he asked his wife how the mattress happened to catch fire, she told him the peculiar truth. All truths in that house were peculiar. That his youngest son, Robert, had set it on fire with a buggy whip. It seemed he had lighted the lash of the whip in the gas grate of the nursery and applied it to the mattress. I also have a vivid memory of the night my mother was alone in the house with her 3 small sons and set the oil-splashed bowl of a kerosene lamp on fire, trying to light the wick, and herded all of us out of the house, announcing that it was going to explode. We children waited across the street in high anticipation, but the spilled oil burned itself out, and to our bitter disappointment, the house did not go up like a skyrocket to scatter colored balloons among the stars. My mother claimed that my brother William, who was 7 at the time, kept crying, "Try it again, Mama, try it again." But she was a famous hand at ornamenting a tale, and there is no way of telling whether he did or not. My brightest remembrance of the old house goes back to the confused and noisy second and last visit of Aunt Mary, who had cut her first visit short because she hated our 2 dogs, Judge, an irritable old pug, and Samson, a restless water spaniel, and they hated her. She had snarled at them, and they had growled at her all during her stay with us, and not even my mother remembered how she persuaded the old lady to come back for a weekend, but she did, and what is more, she cajoled Aunt Mary into feeding those dreadful brutes the evening she arrived. In preparation for this seemingly simple act of household routine, my mother had spent the afternoon gathering up all the dogs of the neighborhood in advance of Aunt Mary's appearance and putting them in the cellar. I had been allowed to go with her on her wonderful forays, and I thought that we were going to keep all the 16 dogs we rounded up. Such an adventure does not have to have logical point or purpose in the mind of a 6-year-old, and I accepted as a remarkable but natural phenomenon my mother's sudden assumption of the stature of Santa Claus. She did not always let my father in on her elaborate pranks, but he came home that evening to a house heavy with tension and suspense, and she whispered to him the peculiar truth that there were 12.5 dogs in the cellar, counting our Judge and Samson. "What are you up to now, Mame?" he asked her, and she said she just wanted to see Aunt Mary's face when the dogs swarmed up into the kitchen. She could not recall where she had picked up all of the dogs, but I remembered, and still do, that we had imprisoned the Johnsons' Irish Terrier, the Eisels' Shepherd, and the Mitchells' Fox Terrier, among others. "Well, let's get it over with, then," my father said nervously. "I want to eat dinner in peace, if that's possible." The big moment finally arrived. My mother, full of smiles and insincerity, told Aunt Mary that it would relieve her of a tedious chore, and heaven knows, she added, there were 1,000 steps to take in that big house if the old lady would be good enough to set down a plate of dog food in the kitchen at the head of the cellar stairs and call Judge and Samson to their supper. Aunt Mary growled and grumbled and consigned all dogs to the fires of hell, but she grudgingly took the plate and carried it to the kitchen, with the Thurber family on her heels. "Heavenly days!" cried Aunt Mary. "Do you make a ceremony out of feeding these brutes?" She put the plate down and reached for the handle of the door. None of us has ever been able to understand why Bedlam hadn't broken loose in the cellar long before this, but it hadn't. The dogs were probably so frightened by their unique predicament that their belligerence had momentarily left them. But when the door opened and they could see the light of freedom and smell the lure of food, they gave tongue like a pack of hunting hounds. Aunt Mary got the door halfway open, and the bodies of 3 of the largest dogs pushed it the rest of the way. There was a snarling, barking, yelping swirl of yellow and white, black and tan, gray and brindle, as the dogs tumbled into the kitchen, skidded on the linoleum, sent the food flying from the plate, and backed Aunt Mary into a corner. "Great God Almighty," she screamed, "it's a dog factory." She was only 5 feet tall, but her counterattack was swift and terrible. Grabbing a broom, she opened the back door and the kitchen windows and began to beat and flail at the army of canines, engaged now in 6 separate battles over the scattered food. Dogs flew out the back door and leaped through the windows, but some of them ran upstairs, and 3 or 4 others hid under sofas and chairs in the parlor. The indignant snarling and cursing of Judge and Sampson rose above even the laughter of my mother and the delighted squeals of her children. Aunt Mary whammed her way from room to room, driving dogs ahead of her. When the last one had departed, and the upset house had been put back in order, my father said to his wife, "Well, Mame, I hope you're satisfied." She was. Aunt Mary, toward the end of her long life, got the curious notion that it was my father and his sons, and not my mother, who had been responsible for the noisy flux of all those brutes. Years later, when we visited the old lady on one of her birthdays, she went over the story again, as she always did, touching it up with distortions and magnifications of her own. Then she looked at the male Thurbers in slow, rueful turn, sighed deeply, gazed sympathetically at my mother, and said in her hollowest tone, "Poor Mary." Only a few months after poor Mary borrowed the neighbor's dogs, she bought the Simmonses' house. It was a cold, blocky house, not far from ours, and its owner had been trying to sell it for a long time. The thing had become a standing joke among the Frioleras, a club of young married couples to which the Simmonses and my father and mother belonged. It was generally believed that Harry and Laura would never get the big damp place off their hands. Then, late one dark afternoon, a strange and avid purchaser showed up. It was my mother, wearing dark glasses, her hair and eyebrows whitened with flour, her cheeks lightly shadowed with charcoal to make them look hollow, and her upper front teeth covered with the serrated edge of a soda cracker. On one side of her, as she pressed the doorbell of the Simmonses' house, stood a giggling cousin of hers named Belle Cook, and I was on her other side. We were there to prevent a prolonged scrutiny of the central figure of our trio. Belle was to pose as my mother's daughter, and I was to be Belle's son. Simmons had never met Miss Cook, and my mother was confident that he wouldn't recognize me. His wife, Laura, would have penetrated her friend's disguise at once, or failing that, she would surely have phoned the police, for the weird visitor seemed, because of her sharp, projecting teeth, both demented and about to spring. But my mother had found out that Laura would not be home. When she made herself up an hour before, I had watched her transformation from mother to witch with a mixture of wonder and worry that lingered in my memory for years. Harry Simmons, opening his front door on that dark evening in the age of innocence, when trust flowered as readily as suspicion does today, was completely taken in by the sudden apparition of an eccentric elderly woman who babbled of her recently inherited fortune and said she had passed his house the day before and fallen in love with it. Simmons was a big, jovial, sanguine man, expert at business deals in a lighted office, but a setup for my mother's deviltry at dusk. When she praised every room she stumbled into and every object she bumped against, she wouldn't take off her dark glasses even in the lamplit gloom. A wild hope must have glazed his eye, disarming his perception. He admitted later, when the cat was out of the bag, that Belle's idiotic laughter and mine at everything that was said had disturbed him, especially when it was provoked by my mother's tearful account of the sad death of her mythical husband, a millionaire oil man. But idiocy in a family is one thing, and money is another. Mrs. Prentice, or Douglas, or whatever she called herself, was rolling in money that day. She upped Simmons's asking price for the house by several $1,000s on the ground that she wouldn't think of paying as little as $10,000 for such a lovely place. When she found out that the furniture was for sale, she upped the price on that, too, promising to send her check through her lawyers the next day. By this time, she was overacting with fine abandon, but the overwhelmed Simmons was too far gone in her land of fantasy for reality to operate. On her way out of the house, she picked up small portable things, a vase, a traveling clock, a few books, remarking that after all they now belonged to her. Still, Simmons's wits did not rally, and all of a sudden the three of us were out in the street again, my mother, who had been my grandmother, her cousin, who had been my mother, and me. I feel that this twisted hour marked the occupation of my mind by a sense of confusion that has never left it. My father was home from work when we got back, and he gasped at the sight of his wife, even though she had thrown away her cracker teeth. When these latest goings-on were explained to him, he was all for taking his friend's possessions over to his unsold house and returning them, with nervous apologies. But my mother had another idea. That night she gift-wrapped separately the vase, the clock, and the books, and they were delivered to Simmons's door the next morning before he set out for his office, each present containing a card that read, "To Harry Simmons from Mame Thurber with love." It was not my mother's most subdued performance, but it was certainly one of her outstanding triumphs. The Frioleras laughed about it for years. There had been 50 of them when the club was founded in 1882. At one of their parties, 50 years ago, they played Pedro and euchre in the winter and went on picnics and bicycle trips in the summer. My father asked his wife, apropos of what prank I do not know, "How long do you expect to keep up this kind of thing, Mame?" She thought a moment and replied, "Why, until I'm 80, I suppose." Mary Agnes Thurber, eldest of the 6 children of William and Catherine Fisher, was 80 years old in January 1946, and I went to Columbus for a birthday party that brought together scores of her relatives. The day after the event, a columnist in one of the Columbus papers recklessly described her as a bit of lavender and old lace. She was indignant. "Why, he doesn't even know about the time I threw those eggs," she exclaimed. I didn't know about it either, but I found out. At a meeting a few months before of one of the several women's clubs she belonged to, she had gone to the kitchen of her hostess's house, carefully removed a dozen eggs from a cardboard container, and returned to the living room to reactivate a party that she had felt was growing dull. Balancing the box on the palm of her hand, like a halfback about to let go a forward pass, she cried, "I've always wanted to throw a dozen eggs, and now I'm going to do it." The ladies gathered in the room, squealed and scattered as the carton sailed into the air. Then it drifted harmlessly to the floor. Lavender and old lace, in their conventional and symbolic sense, were not for Mary Thurber. It would be hard for me to say what was. She never wore black. Black is for old ladies, she told me scornfully. In 1884, when Mamie Fisher got out of high school, she wanted to go on the stage. But her unladylike and godless urge was discouraged by her family. Aunt Melissa warned her that young actresses were in peril not only of hellfire, but of lewd Shakespearean actors, skilled in the arts of seduction, and she pointed out that there was far too much talk about talent in the world, and not enough about virtue. She predicted that God's wrath would be visited in his own time upon all theaters, beginning, like as not, with those in Paris, France. Mamie Fisher listened with what appeared to be rapt and contrite attention. Actually, she was studying Aunt Melissa's voice so that she could learn to imitate it. Deprived of a larger audience, the frustrated comedienne performed for whoever would listen, and once distressed a couple of stately guests in her father's home by descending the front stairs in her dressing gown, her hair tumbling and her eyes staring, to announce that she had escaped from the attic, where she was kept because of her ardent and hapless love for Mr. Briscoe, the postman. An entry in her diary of that period, dated Monday, May 14th, 1888, would have puzzled the shocked visitors. "Went over to Flora's to talk over yesterday's visit. I tell you that Ira D. is cute, but I do not like him very well. He is a perfect gentleman, only he will insist on kissing me every time, and I will not allow it. I can truthfully say I never kissed a fellow in all my life but once, and that was Charlie Thurber at the depot a few years ago." Those of her relatives who drew no sharp line between life and art, the gifted and the mad, and consoled themselves with the hope that marriage would settle her down, could not have been more mistaken. Even the birth of her third son in 1896 had little effect on her merry inventions, and her aunts must have been relieved when we left Champion Avenue and moved to Washington, D.C. in 1901. They probably thought of Washington in those years as a city of inviolable decorum, but it was there that we met a young Cleveland newspaperman named George Marvin, whose gaiety was to enrich our lives. He was a superior wag with a round, mobile face, a trick of protruding his large eyeballs that entranced the Thurber boys, and a gift of confusion that matched my mother's. Uncivil clerks and supercilious shop proprietors in the nation's capital came to regret their refusal to sell Marvin and my mother one dish of ice cream with 2 spoons, or a single glove for the left hand, or one shoe. The mild, soft-spoken Jekylls from the Middle West would be transformed into Mr. and Mrs. Hyde, to the consternation of the management. "Senator Beveridge will hear about this," Marvin would shout, and they would stalk out of the shop in high and magnificent dudgeon. But it was when we were all back in Columbus 2 years later that these comics reached their heights. Their finest hour arrived one day at Memorial Hall during a lecture given by a woman mental healer, whose ability and sincerity my mother held in low esteem. She has always been a serious and devoted student of psychotherapy, even when it was known and practiced under foolish and flowery names, and she learned long ago to detect tommy-rot. Arriving after the lecture had begun, our cut-ups found an empty wheelchair in the lobby, and my mother, bundled up in it, was rolled down the aisle by her confederate. The lady on the platform had reached a peroration of whoosh, during which she chanted that if you had done it before, you could do it again, whatever it was, and other candy-coated inspiration to that effect. At the peak of this marshmallow mentation, my mother leaped from the chair, crying that she had walked before and she could do it again. Some 10 or 20 persons of the 200 present must have recognized her, but the others were caught between cheers and consternation. The lecturer shouted, "Hallelujah, sister!" and at this point Marvin increased the confusion by bulging out his eyes, dropping his jaw, and mumbling that what he had done before he was now doing again, namely losing his grip on reality. The crisis ended when a querulous man shouted, "Hey, that's my wheelchair!" and the culprits made good their escape. The career of almost any actress is marked by open dates and, in the end, a long period of retirement. Who heard of the late Julia Marlowe in her last 20 years? But my mother's crowded calendar shows no season of repose, and the biographer is overwhelmed by instances and can only select a few more. There was the time she went back to Washington in her 60s wearing a red rose so the woman she was going to meet could identify her. They hadn't seen each other for 30 years. The train being early, or her hostess late, she pinned the rose on a sleeping dowager 20 years her senior, who was sitting on a bench in the railway terminal, and watched at a distance the dismay of her friend when she finally arrived, and the irritability of the sleeper awakened by a cry of, "Why, Mame Thurber, how are you? You're looking just fine." And there was the occasion, not long ago, when she deflated a pompous gentleman, overproud of his forebears, who made the mistake of asking her how far back she had traced her own ancestry. "Until I came to a couple of horse thieves," she said with a troubled sigh. "Do you mean a father and son?" the shocked man asked. "Or was it a couple of brothers?" My mother sighed again. "It was much worse than that," she said. "A man and his wife. You see, it runs in both sides of the family." 100 other hours and moments I leave to the record of another year. With all this to take up her time, Mrs. Charles Thurber nevertheless managed to run her home like any other good housewife, hovering over the cook when we had one, following the cleaning woman around with pail and cloth of her own, and rearing 3 sons who were far from being mother's helpers. She was famous for her pastry, and after long study and practice, learned to make the best chocolate creams in the world. 2 or 3 professional candy men tried to catch her secret, watching her at work like a child watching a magician, and with just about as little profit. She made her last 20 pounds of chocolates when she was 80, and then turned to writing a cookbook of her own recipes. I found in going over her letters that time hasn't dulled their sparkle. In one, dated December 26, 1949, she told, in fine, full detail, the story of her 1933 search for Miss Bagley, which has become a family saga. Miss Annette Bagley, known to her intimates as Anna, wandered from her home in England more than 60 years ago to become a home-to-home sewing woman in Columbus. She and my mother became great friends, and then one morning in the spring of 1895, Miss Bagley, at the age of 34, took a train to Boston, where she planned to open a dressmaking shop. For several years, my mother's fond letters were promptly answered, but about the turn of the century, 2 of them were returned by the Boston post office. Miss Bagley had dropped out of sight, leaving no forwarding address, and it wasn't until 1913 that she was heard from again. The floods of that year had inundated Columbus, and she sent a worried telegram from Boston. My mother replied by wire that all her friends were safe, and Miss Bagley apparently received this telegram at the Western Union office, in which she had dispatched her own. But a letter my mother instantly sent to the old address was returned like the others. 20 silent years went by. In 1933, Mary Thurber took up the quest again, writing to the postmasters of Boston and surrounding towns, and inventing a story about the settlement of an estate. Money, she wrote me in the 1949 letter, always increases people's interest. It greatly increased the interest of an Anna Bagley in Malden, Massachusetts, who turned out to be the wrong one, and with whom my mother exchanged a brief and cloudy correspondence. Then she came east to take up the search in person. She was 67, and she knew that Miss Bagley, if she was alive, was 72. In Boston, my mother set out on the old, dim trail like a trained researcher, looking up outdated phone books and directories at the Chamber of Commerce. The most recent record of Annette Bagley she could find placed her friend in Malden in 1925, so she went to Malden. Miss Bagley was not at the address listed, and the woman who lived there had never heard of her. My mother did what any good reporter would have done. She looked up old residents of the neighborhood and called on the older druggists and grocers. She learned that Annette Bagley had left that Malden house about 7 years before. Someone seemed to remember that the old lady had moved to Everett Street. This street turned out to be only a block long, and my mother rang all its doorbells without success. Nobody knew anything about Miss Bagley. Then a druggist suggested that her quarry might have moved not to Everett Street, but to the town of Everett, which is only a few miles from Malden. My mother transferred her pattern of search to Everett, and it was in that Boston suburb that the trail became warm. She found Annette Bagley listed in a 3-year-old directory, but the elusive dressmaker was no longer at the address given. Neighbors, however, thought she had not gone far away, so her tracer continued questioning druggists and grocers and elderly people she stopped on the street. At twilight of the second day of her search, she came upon a small dressmaking shop on a side street. I looked through the window, my mother wrote, and there she was, sitting and sewing with her back to me. 38 years had made a great difference in the two friends, and it wasn't until my mother asked the old lady if she had ever lived in Columbus, Ohio, that Annette Bagley recognized her. The reason for her years of hiding was simple enough. She did not want her Columbus friends to know that her dream of a big and flourishing dressmaking establishment of her own had failed to come true. I took her to dinner in Boston, my mother wrote, and then to a movie. It was hard for her to believe that my oldest son, William, was 40, for when she had seen him last, he was only 2. I'm not sure about the movie, but I think it was It Happened One Night or One Sunday Afternoon or something like that. It isn't often that my memory outdoes my mother's, but I have always remembered the name of that movie since she first told me the story of her celebrated search for Annette Bagley 24 years ago. It was called I Loved You Wednesday. In New York, which my mother visited often, she liked to escape from her sons and see the sights of the city on her own. One morning, some 25 years ago, she reached the second floor of the famous Wendell House on Fifth Avenue, but her tour of inspection was interrupted. "I was just going by, and I thought I would drop in," she told me. On that visit, she made a tour of Greenwich Village by herself, but asked me to take her to what she called the Tonys and the 21, whose fame she had somehow heard about. At the Tonys, she was fortunate enough to meet one of her idols, the late Heywood Broun, and she enchanted him by casting an offhand horoscope for him that turned out to be a recognizable portrait done in the bold colors of both virtue and shortcoming. She had always had a lot of fun monkeying around with the inexact sciences. She corresponded with Evangeline Adams, and once had Professor Coué out to dinner at our house in Columbus, and I am sure that she must have dipped into Dianetics. She embarrassed my father one time in an impish numerology phase by making him return a set of ominously numbered automobile license plates and exchange it for a safer one. In 1940, when she entered Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center for a major operation that she took in her stride, she demanded to know the date of birth of her distinguished surgeon before she would let him operate. He solemnly gave it to her and was pleased to learn that he had been engaged for 30 years in a profession for which his signs clearly fitted him. Later, he was astonished by her familiarity with medicine and surgery, and told her one day that she had the sound implementation of a nurse. "Of course," my mother said, "I'm Capricorn with the moon in Sagittarius." The day she was discharged from the hospital, she decided to visit the World's Fair, and she did in spite of heat and humidity. In a bus on the way back, she found that she had exceeded her strength, and she asked the bus driver to take her pulse. He took it with one hand, continuing to drive with the other, and reported that it was a little high, but nothing to worry about. I am sure she got the bus driver's date of birth. She remembered the birthdays of literally hundreds of men and women. She once sent me a clipping of an Earl Wilson column in which he had given Dorothy Parker's birthday as August 23rd. "Dorothy Parker's birthday is August 22nd, my mother wrote. August 23rd is Helen Gouda's birthday." A few years ago, I phoned her in Columbus and asked her if she remembered her surgeon's birthday. "Why, certainly," she said. "He was born on the 30th of March. My Columbus surgeon is also Aries, April 1st. When my mother came to New York in 1947, I found that she had made a date for tea at the Algonquin with an old friend of my father's, Charles Dewey Hiles. She said that she herself hadn't seen him for a long time. Mr. Hiles, a celebrated Ohio Republican, died 8 years ago, and his long obituaries told of his having been, among many other things, an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under Taft, Chairman of the Republican National Committee from 1912 to 1916, and a member of dozens of boards of directors. I had the good luck to be asked to the Ohio Tea Party, along with the late John McNulty, for many years a reporter on Columbus newspapers. We had a jolly time, and various ancient facts and forgotten dates were brought up. It came out that my mother was a year older than Mr. Hiles. "When was it," I finally asked, "that you two last met?" My mother thought about this and said, "Well, Mr. Hiles was secretary to the superintendent of the Boys' Industrial School at Lancaster, Ohio. Let me see. Yes, it must have been in 1888. My mother was 22 in 1888, and Mr. Hiles, of course, was only 21. Now, no elderly man of high and varied achievement likes to be reminded of his juvenile beginnings, and it was obvious to us all that my mother's grasp of her friend's later career was tenuous. McNulty saved the situation. 1888, he said, was the year the Owls were so bad. What Mr. Hiles must have approached as something of an ordeal turned out to be fun for him.